Hey guys, I'm here from the Gibraltar Masters tournament. This is one of the strongest open tournaments all year. There's like so many good players here. I'm very excited to play this event, and I just finished round one earlier today. I won my game. It was a very lucky win, as you'll find out in a little bit. But yeah, I figured what I'll do for this series is just go over my games daily after each round and try to share my thoughts as quickly as possible since I just finished the game a few hours ago. I have analyzed the game with the engine a little bit. What I usually do is I first input the lines that I was thinking about during the game and maybe some possible improvements. And then I check everything through with the engine to see what I missed, what I over-evaluated, underestimated, and well, that's what I'm going to be sharing with you guys today. Okay, so my opponent played d4. And it seems like he was mainly a London system player, so I decided to play d6 with the idea that if he went for the London, he did play bishop f4 and g6. Now, for example, if white played knight f3, I would kind of use the fact that I haven't developed my knight to f6 yet and just play like bishop g7 and then knight bd7 and maybe get a quick e5 in. Maybe the knight can go to e7, for example, where it might be more useful. Instead, actually, he played knight c3, which I wasn't expecting, but I think he has played it once or twice before, so I should have kind of seen this coming. Well, this was fine. I decided to go for bishop g7. He played e4, and now we're basically transposing into the Perk defense. So recently I've taken up this line to play knight c6 super early in every position. Usually it comes from the move order like e4, knight c6, even d4, d6, something like that. So I figured now was a good time to do this since we're getting a pretty, well, semi-typical Perk type position. Okay, the point is to attack the d4 pawn and induce white to advance. Indeed, he pushed. And then I went back with knight to b8. So this is usually black's idea. You induce the advance, you go back, and then we have like a target to attack with c6 and c takes d5. But I really should have went for a different move here, and I was considering it during the game. But for some reason I don't know, didn't feel like playing this type of position. But yeah, I probably should have gone for e5. I think this is a much better move, and it's actually a pretty typical motive in this type of position. I mean, if white takes on Poussin, black is totally fine, just developing very well. If white takes the knight, we'll take on f4, and black is happy to get the darks for bishop. So white should probably just back up bishop e3, and then I'll play knight to e7, and yeah, I wasn't sure what kind of King's Indian this is going to be without the pawn on c4. So I didn't really feel like playing this type of position today. I kind of wanted something more open, so I decided just to go back. But this is a very provocative move, and in a couple moves white could have seized a really big advantage. So knight f6, f3, c6. Actually, instead of f3, he immediately could have just gone for like bishop h6. This is a pretty typical plan, and I've given up some time, so it makes even more sense now. I was probably going to trade and then place a move here like maybe c6 or something. I haven't analyzed this one too deeply, but Stockfish really hates this position for black. It gives already like +1 to white or something, and that's pretty logical. White has a lot of extra space, and I'm guessing the computer finds some very concrete lines here. But in a game, I think it wouldn't be that easy for white. Okay, but he kind of plays more typically with f3 and going for like this English attack setup. But I figure if he does an English attack, then black is probably okay because I'm going to be chipping away at his center here, and the diagonal for my bishop is already open. So it feels like I'm getting like a pretty nice version of the dragon at some point. Okay, he castles queenside, which I thought was good, and I take on d5. Here I really expected e takes d5. I think this move is kind of simple and strong. And already I was actually kind of feeling a lack of space here, because if I put my bishop on f5, like I would really like to, I'm just going to immediately get hit with g4, and the bishop can't stay there. And then I have two pieces who want to use the d7 square, the bishop and the knight as well. So I was thinking I would probably put the bishop on d7, and then maybe knight goes to a6, and then I can finally bring my rook to c8. But while I was thinking about this, I took on d5, and then he threw out bishop b5 check, which I was really happy to see, because I realized, okay, he wants to force a trade of light squared bishops, and that totally solves my space problem, because I can just trade off my most passive piece, my knight gets into the game, and I think all of a sudden black is just going to be clearly better. So this was a really huge mistake. I think he was kind of playing a little bit too, let's say, prototypically, thinking that his pawns are on light squares, so he should trade off the light squared bishops. And technically, yeah, his light square bishop could be a passive piece, but for the moment, I mean, it's going to be controlling a lot of squares in the position. More importantly, he kind of totally relaxes the space advantage by trading pieces, which I think is a really big deal, because black's position becomes much more easy to play. So bishop d7 takes, and now after something like e takes d5, I would play rook c8, and I think it's just like a perfect dragon. Knight is coming to b6. I have the c4 square, the queen can come to a5, and it seems like black's pieces are just perfectly placed. I'll probably castle at some point, and I think it'll just be a crushing position. Instead, he actually ends up taking on d5 with the knight, and I decide to trade, and he takes with the queen. Okay, so finally, after a little bit of thought, I decided to castle here. I was also thinking about like rook c8, but I figure, okay, this is the most flexible move, and well, he goes for h4. I think this is pretty reasonable, but I was feeling extremely comfortable here as black, and I felt like I'm already on the verge of a huge advantage, just because it seems like my pieces have a lot more scope and open files. Like, again, the rook gets the c file, the bishop has a diagonal, I have queen b6. Yeah, eventually I decided to play queen b6. It wasn't my only move. I think Stockfish was really liking the plan of queen c7 and rook c8. And yeah, this actually ends up being super strong, because if white plays something like rook d2 to defend the c2 pawn, I have knight b6, and the knight is just coming to c4 next move, and then I'm going to be taking on b2. So there are definitely some complications, because white is almost ready to take on g6, but I think black's attack is just coming with much more force. So that would have been already kind of close to winning for black. Okay, I went for queen b6, he played queen b3, which I was expecting, and queen a6. And now I just want to play my knight to c5 with tempo, and then from c5 probably play knight a4, which looks very annoying. So he goes bishop e3, kind of preparing to trade off the bishop for the knight, and I kind of was a little bit rash here, and I just kind of went for it, because I figured, okay, knight c5 takes, this position is definitely good for black, my bishop is really strong. I have c4 coming, where because white's queen is going to be it's going to have to defend the a2 pawn, then he's going to have to play like queen a3 against c4. And already I can take and ruin his pawn structure. So this looked like a big advantage for black. I kind of didn't second guess it and just went for it. But okay, Stockfish told me that probably rook ac8 was stronger, with the idea of playing knight c5 and just taking with the rook and keeping the c file open. And yeah, once you see it on the board, it's like fair enough. Rook b5 is a huge threat. I have rook fc8 coming, and white is just not really surviving this position. So yeah, I think had I just been a little bit more measured, the game probably wouldn't have lasted too long from there. But okay, knight c5, he trades, knight h3, and already I saw I could play this trick with c4, queen a3, and c3. And he can't take my pawn because his queen is hanging, so he would be forced to play queen takes a6, I get c takes b2 check, king b1, and I take back on a6. And so black is up a very strong pawn on b2, but it's kind of a question of like whether black can break through in the position, because white is just going to be trying to build a fortress. I felt like black should have great winning chances here, and I think that's definitely the case, -1, 1.2, something like that. But I figured I don't have to go for this right away, because, well, white's king is on c1, and I feel like I have a lot of attacking chances. So I started with rook c8, with the intention of lifting the rook via c6 to b6, which I felt like was a pretty active plan. Then he pushes f4, which is probably a good idea, trying to shut down my bishop with e5. Now I realize I don't really have like all the time in the world, because if he plays e5 and then can kind of hold this barrier, then my bishop will be passive and restricted, and eventually his knight can come to g5 and maybe get some activity. So I figured now I have to kind of do something, and I went for c4, queen a3, and c3. So I end up going for the endgame, which I think was a fine decision, at least at this point, because black is definitely getting a serious advantage here. So I take on a6, he pushes e5, and important move f6. Otherwise my bishop is just going to get stuck, and yeah, I definitely need this move to open the diagonal and also open up the f-file for my rook. So I felt like this was an important move. He goes rook e1, defending the pawn, and I really should have just taken and played rook c5 and picked the pawn up. I think I was seeing some ghosts here with like knight g5 and knight e6, but there's really not much going on here. I can play rook takes e5, and I'm just keeping some extra pawns here. So this would have been good for black. Instead, I play rook c7. I was really just trying to be like super restrictive, just cover the 7th rank. You know, if he takes on f6, I take with my bishop, and everything is good. And okay, I was expecting him to take the pawn on b2, and I wasn't too upset about giving this one up. My idea now is just to eventually pick up the e5 pawn and use the fact that I have a clearly superior minor piece in the position. So it's kind of like a long-term endgame plan. So I took fe5 and I played h6, which I thought was a nifty move because I'm taking away the g5 square, and now the knight is like totally cut, can't go to any of these squares, and is really sidelined. Stockfish thinks rook c5 was better than just taking the pawn. Fair enough. Well, h6, rook d5, now he tries to really hold on to it. And I play this move e6, which I think is okay because I'm kind of dislodging his rook. Now he should have played rook a5, I think, and then rook c6, and black is slightly better. But he played rook d6, which kind of falls for a trap, although technically white can kind of get out of it. So rook fc8. Now I'm threatening the c2 pawn. Most natural move is to play rook e2, but he correctly avoided this because this would run into a nice tactic. Rook takes c2, takes, bishop takes e5 check, king has to go to b3 or b1, and now it's important I don't take on c2, because king takes, bishop takes d6, that would be winning, but rook d8 check, and then white ends up with an extra rook. But instead I have rook b8 check. King has to move, and I'm going to take on d6 next, and black is going to be 2 pawns up and totally winning. So he spotted that one in time and very correctly played knight f4, just taking the opportunity to get his knight back into the game. So now things get very sharp here, because I take on c2, he plays king b1, and it's actually not clear how black should proceed. At first I was super optimistic because I thought I could play like rook c4, for example, and then I was expecting knight takes e6, and then I found this nice trick which basically just wins on the spot. Rook b8 check, king a1, and bishop takes e5, and white gets mated on c1. So this is kind of unplayable for white. Eventually I realized that he has to take on g6, and once I saw this, I realized actually it's very hard for me to get the bishop into the game, because I can't play bishop f8, he'll just take it. The e5 pawn is very well guarded, and yeah, knight e7 check is also a threat, so I have to kind of watch out for that. So then my next thought was to play bishop f8 in this position without moving the rook before the knight gets to g6. But the problem is he takes on g6 anyway, and if I take on d6, he recaptures. He's threatening knight e7 check, and he's also threatening d7 because my rook on c2 is technically kind of vulnerable. And I didn't see a way out here. I think white is at least fine, maybe even more than fine. So yeah, I think I burned a ton of time here trying to figure out what to do, and I realized like I might not be, or it might be like very, very close to not being better, or maybe I have to find some very precise moves to figure it out. Eventually, I think I made the right solution, so I'm really glad I spent time here. And I went for this move, rook f2. So I'm hitting the knight, I'm forcing him to take one of the pawns, and I'm preparing to, well, at least potentially lift my rook to the 7th rank, which I never did in the game, but the threat is definitely important. So he takes on g6. It turns out, according to Stockfish, he should have taken on e6, but this is very, very scary. After rook b8 check, he has to play king c1 and allow rook takes a2. And okay, according to Stockfish, he can just take on g7 and he's fine. But yeah, during the game, it's hard to go for this line as white. Taking on g6 is much more natural. You threaten knight e7 check, and you guard the e5 pawn, and you're really restricting. My arrows are terrible. You're really restricting the bishop on g7. Okay, so I threw in rook b8 check. I think this is important. He plays king a1. And now this is a really critical moment, and I actually managed to find the right move here, but not the right follow-up after that. But I think this was a really instructive one. So my first thought was to somehow get the bishop into the game, but there's no way to dislodge the knight, because any move like king h7 or king f7 is just going to be met with h5. So I decided to just play h5 myself. And I kind of prevent white from getting his knight out, and I also open up bishop h6 with the potential threat of like bishop d2 and then bishop c3 mate. So this is quite serious, but of course I'm giving up some pawns here. So he plays rook takes e6, this is pretty critical, and my first intention here was to play bishop h6, but eventually I just didn't like the move rook to b1, and I calculated one line here. I didn't check this one with the engine, so I don't know if it's accurate or not, but it seems like it's working for white. Here, okay, he's fighting for the file. My one idea is to take and play king f7, but after rook takes a6, rook takes g2, this is what I was calculating. It seems like his knight is kind of trapped and getting caught, but he has this resource. Unless I'm missing something else. Actually, yeah, rook f6 check seems like it's also saving. And then the knight can jump back to f4, and white looks okay here. But the one that really bothered me during the game was just e6 check, which might be even stronger. Because I take the knight, he pushes e7, and I have to abandon my bishop, and white is going to end up with an extra pawn. So that didn't work. I thought about king f7, because I'm like attacking his pieces. Rook takes a6, and rook takes g2. But this one didn't work because of knight f4, I believe. He's kind of just getting out, and he's getting rook takes a7 check next, and... oh no, actually this one's not working, because I have bishop takes e5, and the same checkmate on the back rank. Oh, but he has rook f1 check, I think may be better. And my king has to move, and I'm not winning the knight. But I actually missed one. So king f7 was the right move, and after takes, this is a good time to pause the video and try to find a winning tactic for black. Okay, winning move is rook b6. A very clever move. So he can't take on a7 because his knight will drop, and after the rooks trade, it turns out the knight runs short on squares, which is a recurring theme in this game. So yeah, that was basically winning, though after king f7, yeah, actually if he doesn't play rook takes a6, it doesn't matter. Rook d6 or rook c6 run into the same move, rook b6, and white is basically busted. So that was definitely a miss, but not an easy tactic. Eventually I decided to take the g2 pawn, but this allows knight f4, and his knight is getting out. But I still felt like I could fight for an advantage here, and eventually I found the right move, king f7, which turns out to be an only move. So nice idea. If he takes on g2, I want to take his rook on e6, and then we transition into this somewhat simplified position where my king is going to be super active, and the bishop is going to be really strong too. And white's king on a1 this whole time has just been a sitting duck. As you can imagine, I was really trying to checkmate this king for like the last 5-10 moves. But white doesn't really have another move here, because if the rook moves off the e-file, I'm going to take on e5 and checkmate him. And a move like rook f1, which looks very tempting, actually does nothing, because the knight still can't move without losing defense over the rook. So I would play rook g4 here. I'm threatening to take the knight, and king takes e6. Bishop takes e5 is hanging in the air as well, so white is basically just lost here. So he takes on g2. This is, I think, again, the only move. King takes e6. Now knight f4 check, very important. King f5, knight d3, and rook d8. So I definitely felt like I still had decent chances here, just because my king is so much more active. And if I pick up the pawn on e5, I'm a pawn up. It's a doubled pawn, so it's really not worth that much more. But having an extra pawn can definitely be useful. And there are situations in this game where he's able to pick up one pawn but not the second, and because of that, black is winning. So having an extra pawn, yeah, in some positions can really make a lot of difference. But more importantly, I just want to go after the h4 pawn. And if I can win this one, especially with like a rook trade, then the bishop versus knight endgame should be very favorable for black. So it was a tough defense, but I think he did a good job. Okay, he plays rook g1, bishop h6, knight c5. Now I think he's kind of starting to go wrong, but I end up missing my chance. Bishop e3. This looks like a pretty nice double attack, but he has the way out. Rook f1 check. But now king g4, and the problem is everything in his position is hanging. I'm ready to take the h-pawn, and I have bishop d4 check, bishop takes e5 coming. Okay, so here he played knight e4, and yeah, this was probably my biggest mistake of the game. Because it's move 40, and I went for this move rook to b8, which turns out to be a very, very concrete decision, meaning there's a lot of lines to calculate here, and I definitely didn't calculate them correctly during the game. Instead, I should have just gone with the simple move bishop d4 check, king b1, bishop takes e5. Then we get this position where I'm a clear pawn up, my king is much more active, and I think black has great winning chances here. Is probably winning. I think Stockfish was saying this is like, -2, -2.5. Even the rook endgame after like knight f6 check, takes, black pushes a5, rook a6, rook d5. And white can win back one of the pawns, but king takes h4. And this one looks like a straight up win for black, because the rook can just block on the g-file, and the king is super active, the pawn is marching up, and white just has no counterplay. So this one seems like a pretty clear win. So yeah, that was kind of a simple miss. I played rook b8 because I was just trying to get the mating ideas down, and I thought if white plays a move like rook to d1, then I have rook to b4. And I'm kind of insisting on bishop d4 check, so this looked very nice. But he finds knight f6 check, which turns out to be quite good. I totally disregarded this move because I thought this is a useless check. I just take on h4, and I'm still threatening bishop d4 mate. But rook h1 check, he's winning back the pawn with check. So king g5, we're going to have rook takes h5 check. And then white definitely ends up okay here. I think king f4. There's knight d5, and he's fine. So my other option is king g3, which I ended up going for. This allows him to take on h5 with the knight with check, but here I started realizing, well, maybe a little bit earlier, that his knight on h5 can get stuck, and if my bishop still gets to e5, then the knight is just going to be dominated and trapped. So I might be able to win this knight and win the game based on that. So I kept fighting. I kept looking for chances here, although, as you can imagine, like I was definitely getting a little bit frustrated that I squandered such a huge advantage earlier. But what can you do? Okay, he ends up playing rook d1, which I think was a miss. I think rook h4 was a better way to cover the d4 square. The problem with rook d1 is that black again has this idea with rook b4, and now bishop d4 check is coming. He played the only move here, so he finally gives up this pawn with a4, giving some breathing room for the king. I was really hoping for rook d3, and for a while it looked like he was intending on making this move, but this actually loses pretty nicely, so I would play king e4 here. Now the idea of this move is to play rook b3 and cover the b file, but black can take. And actually, black should give check first. I think this is pretty important, because if we take, maybe there's some additional options with knight f6 check, although actually I don't think this one is working because of king takes e5. But in any case, bishop d4 check I think is more accurate. King b1, take the rook with check, a takes b3, and bishop takes e5. And the knight ends up trapped, and white's king is just too far away. Actually, another reason this is more accurate is that this king ends up on b1, so we're just taking a couple moves to win the knight, and white's king is not in time to grab the pawns on the a file. Take king a5, and even if white had an extra tempo and took the a6 pawn, black just plays bishop d4 and everything is covered. I'm kind of lucky that the bishop can anchor the pawn and it's kind of the right color promotion square. That definitely wasn't planned in advance, but yeah, these a pawns turn out to be quite good. So that was kind of a key line, but we didn't end up getting that one. Instead he plays a4, which was the right move. I play bishop d4 check, king a2, bishop takes e5. So now the knight is caught, and it seems like black has some ideas here. I want to play rook h4, king g4, and hit the knight, so he has to be very precise here. He played king a3, and my first thought was rook h4, but I think I didn't like the move. Not knight f6 right away, but I think rook f1 check. And then if the king doesn't attack the rook, white will play knight f6 and get out. If the king does attack the rook, then white has rook f5, and I think is okay. The knight is getting out next move. So instead I played rook b6, which I thought was a lot more interesting because I'm covering the f6 square. This is like a key evacuation square for the knight because white wanted to play like rook f1 check and knight f6. And I'm still threatening like rook h6 to take the knight. I'm also defending the a pawn, so if I can keep one pawn on the board, my winning chances are always alive. He goes rook d7, which is a good move. Now he wants to get out via the g7 square. And I realized actually there's no way to avoid the eventual like rook and bishop versus rook endgame, so I decided at this point just to play rook h6. Knight g7 runs into rook h7, and he's losing the piece anyway. Instead, he takes on a7, which I think was the right call because this is kind of inevitable. I take on h5, and he takes my last pawn. So yeah, now we get this endgame, rook and bishop versus rook, which is notoriously difficult to defend, but also difficult to win. Like there are a lot of examples where strong players, they don't defend perfectly, they make a mistake and allow a winning chance, and then the other player misses it, doesn't find it. One of the more famous cases being Caruana versus Fiddler in the Candidates tournament, I think in 2014, when Karyakin won, ended up winning over Caruana. Caruana had like a winning position, like a theoretically known winning position, and either didn't recognize it or couldn't figure out the win in time trouble, and didn't win that game. And Fiddler, to his credit, didn't defend properly. So I definitely felt like, okay, if these 2700 players 2800s don't play this one perfectly, then I should for sure have some chances. And I think with the extra a pawn, it doesn't really help white that much because my king is just running in very quickly, and I think I should be able to round the pawn up and then just play the pure endgame. Or in some cases, it might even interfere with white's defenses. So the game ended abruptly. I'm just going to warn you guys right now. I played king e4, king b4, king d5, king b5, and I went for rook h1. So yeah, I really wasn't sure what my winning chances were here. They're obviously some, but they're not great. So the move my opponent seemingly wanted to make, that I was kind of expecting, is this move rook to g6. Kind of the most natural move, getting the rook out of the way. Then I would play rook b1 check and something like king a6. And yeah, I was analyzing this one a little bit. It turns out like black does most likely pick up the pawn by force. Actually, nice maneuver to put the rook on e8. This is definitely engine analysis. I'm way too tired to analyze this endgame on my own. But yeah, it turns out like this position, bishop c7, a7, bishop b6, black can allow all this and is winning the pawn. And this is still a drawn position, but okay, now we get the endgame, and I could torture my opponent for 50 moves here and try to look for the win. That's just a sample line. I mean, white doesn't have to like push his pawn all the way, but it seems like if he doesn't do that, then eventually black is going to find a way to round up the pawn anyway. So yeah, I was definitely expecting rook g6, and I was just kind of gearing up to play a very, very long game. And then all of a sudden he plays rook h6. And it was very strange because he took his time to make the move, and he even did that thing where like you put a piece down and you check to make sure it's not a blunder. And when he was doing that, I thought for sure he would notice my rook, and with his hand still on the piece, he could just adjust to rook g6, because, okay, it was clear that rook g6 was his idea. But no, the rook stayed on h6, and he just lifted his hand off the rook. And then he didn't even notice at first. He kind of like looked away as if nothing had happened. And then I didn't want to take his rook immediately. I wanted to wait for him to come back to the board, because I felt like, okay, he would just realize what he had done and just resign instantly. Because I was worried if I captured his rook, he would think that I like pushed it over to h6 and took it, like pulled the fast one on him. Because maybe on his score sheet he probably wrote like rook g6, thinking that was the move he made. Or I don't know, maybe he just like totally slipped, in his mind. Maybe my rook was like already on b1 or something, and he just totally forgot it was on h1. The move came after like a pretty long think, like 10 to 15 minutes, and my opponent was someone who was playing quickly the whole game. So for him to take like a long think was definitely unusual, and yeah, it seems like he just totally lost concentration. Yeah, quite a sad blunder. So yeah, finally he like turned to the board, and he was like, what have I done? I took the rook, he resigned, and yeah, that was it. So yeah, super lucky win, for like round one of the Open tournament. I felt like the opening was a little bit shaky, but once bishop b5 check, bishop d7 was on the board, like here black's position was excellent, and I really should have put it away much sooner. And yeah, the endgame was definitely sloppy. Those who follow my channel know my endgame technique has been pretty bad in the past year, and it's kind of one of the main issues I'm working on. But okay, a win is a win, and next round is tomorrow, so I'm gonna get some rest and prepare for that. Thanks a lot for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next videos. Take care.